What's up, guys? Today, I wanted to take a trip down memory lane and look at the best UFC pay-per-views of the last decade from each year, starting with 2014, ending with this year, 2024. And yeah, I just wanted to go back and see how stacked some of these cards were and just some of the matchups we got and go over it. So let's get right into it, guys. Starting off with the year 2014, we have UFC 178. Now, this was one of Demetrius Johnson's title defenses. The main event wasn't all that. We're a little more so looking at under the main event. In the main event, we had Demetrius Johnson versus Chris Carriasso. The co-main event, we had the debut of Eddie Alvarez in the UFC versus Donald Cerrone. That was a hyped up matchup because Eddie Alvarez was a champion in Bellator who was coming over to the UFC, so people were really curious on how he was going to do. Then we had the notorious Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier. McGregor finishing Poirier in the first round, which was quite sick. The lead up of that was great. Then we had Stoolgate with Yoel Romero versus Tim Kennedy. And then we had Kat Zingano versus her shadow because I didn't put the fighter on the screen. So yeah, Kat Zingano on the main card, W. On the prelims, we had the Dominic Cruz versus Takeya Mizugaki fight. Dominic Cruz is on a huge layoff. He comes back and sleeps Takeya Mizugaki in the first round, which is crazy for Dominic Cruz because he's not known as a finisher. You know, Dominic Cruz typically fights to decision. Then on the fight before that, we had Jorge Masvidal fighting James Krause, and I actually never knew they fought. Maybe that's my inner casual. I have been watching the UFC since 2011, and I did not know Masvidal and Krause fought. I believe Masvidal won, but correct me if I'm wrong. And then under that, we had Stephen Thompson versus Patrick Cote. I think Thompson dominated that fight and won a unanimous decision. Brian Ebersol versus John Howard. Kevin Lee versus the cab driver John Tuck. Don't even know who John Tuck is. And Manny Gambarian versus Cody Gibson. Overall, this card had a lot of hype coming in because Conor McGregor was fighting Dustin Poirier and he was talking a lot of trash. And Yoel Romero was up and coming in the UFC, big scary Cuban guy who was jacked out of his mind. And Donald Cerrone, Eddie Alvarez. It had some great matchups on it. And for me, this was the best card of 2014. I really enjoyed it whenever I watched it. It's been a long time, so I haven't watched it in years. But it was a great card for its time. Let's move on to 2015, UFC 194. Now, this card was great. You had Conor McGregor versus Jose Aldo, the long-awaited matchup. It was built up on a world tour of press conferences of back-and-forth trash talk. Conor McGregor torturing Jose Aldo with trash talk. Originally supposed to fight at UFC 189. Jose Aldo bruises his rib. Chad Mendes steps in, and Conor McGregor beats Chad Mendes for the interim strap, setting up this super fight between him and Jose Aldo. At the time of this pay-per-view, Jose Aldo was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Conor McGregor goes in there and sleeps him in 13 seconds. This is probably one of the most crazy moments in UFC history because people thought Conor had a chance to win, but sleeping him in 13 seconds, no one thought that was going to happen. Let's be real. And it kind of felt like we were robbed of the full fight because there was so much buildup, and for it to end like that was kind of anticlimactic, but it was crazy nonetheless. And this shot McGregor into superstardom. In the co-main event, we had Luke Rockhold, Chris Weidman. Chris Weidman famously threw that spinning kick in the third round, which was ultimately his demise, and Luke Rockhold beat the brakes off of him, and this spawned the meme, and this is still my boy. If you know, you know. And then in the feature fight, we had Yoel Romero versus Jacare. At the time, this was an insane matchup. Yoel Romero was 36. Yoel Romero actually came into the UFC late. Like, he was like 34, 35 when he came into the UFC. But he won a split decision over Jacare. And then we had Damian Maia versus Gunnar Nelson. Damian Maia actually dominated Gunnar Nelson in the grappling, which was super impressive, being that Gunnar Nelson was a credentialed grappler, and Damian Maia just showed he was that next level. Max Holloway, Jeremy Stevens, that was a solid fight. Not the most exciting, but it was solid overall. Uriah Faber, Frankie Sainz. Tisha Torres, Jocelyn Lieberger. Boo. Warley Alves submitting Colby Covington. The first guy to finish and defeat Colby Covington, I believe. Leonardo Santos fraud checking Kevin Lee was great. Magomed Mustafayev versus Joe Proctor. Yancy Medeiros versus John McDessie. Yancy Medeiros was a solid fighter for his time. And Court McGee versus Marcio Alessandre Jr. This card was very top-heavy. The main card was insane. And just the Conor McGregor versus Jose Aldo fight, in my opinion, carried this card. But nonetheless, I have this as the best pay-per-view of 2015. Just the build-up, the Conor McGregor-Aldo fight, the Rockhold-Weidman fight, the prospect of Yoel Romero. The whole thing was just great. So UFC 194, one of the best pay-per-views of all time. Let's go to the next year, 2016. Obviously, UFC 205. Now, this was one of the highest selling pay-per-views of all time. is definitely like top 3, top 4. But obviously, you had Conor McGregor, who was just coming off the win over Nate Diaz in the rematch, setting up a super fight with him and Eddie Alvarez, who was the standing lightweight champion. It should have been Khabib off of merit, but Conor McGregor goes up, he gets the shot, he had the superstardom. McGregor puts on one of his best performance in UFC history, in my opinion. This is the best Conor McGregor performance versus Eddie Alvarez, and he just looked like on a whole other level. His striking, his movement, his timing, everything was perfect. He knocked down Eddie Alvarez 3 times until eventually in the second round landing a beautiful, I think, 4-piece combination that finished him, and he became the first simultaneous UFC champion in featherweight and lightweight. He never defended those belts because that's what Conor McGregor does. He just doesn't defend belts. In the co-main event, we had Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Thompson, and that fight was a bit of a banger. It was very close. I think it was ruled a majority draw, if I'm not mistaken, and they ended up rematching at UFC 209, but a good fight nonetheless. Thompson was so close to winning that belt, but he couldn't quite cut it. Joanna Jędrzejczyk destroying Karolina Kowalkiewicz and for another title defense. Yoel Romero flying knee Chris Weidman into the bleachers. That was insane. I was scared for Chris Weidman. Just saw blood at the side of his head. I was like, oh, goodness, what happened? Raquel Pennington versus Miesha Tate. Frankie Edgar versus Jeremy Stevens. A solid scrap. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Michael Johnson, where he notoriously was talking to Dana White while beating Michael Johnson, telling him he has to give up. And then in the post-fight interview, at beginning of year, he tapped like chicken. End of the year, he fight for the title. Crazy. You know this, guys. Khabib going at Conor McGregor, which would later become the biggest fight in UFC history when they did fight. Tim Boetsch getting a KO over Rafael Natal. Vicente Luque, the GOAT, knocking out Bilal Muhammad, one of my favorite knockouts. Jim Miller versus Thiago Alves. And Liz Carmouche versus Caitlin Chukagian. This card was stacked, especially for a Conor McGregor card, because typically they don't stack them because Conor McGregor sells on his own without a stacked card. But this card was pretty stacked. You had Khabib on the prelims. That's how you know it's stacked. I know it was 2016, but still, UFC 205, by far, in my opinion, the best card of 2016. Let's get on to 2017. The best card of 2017, in my opinion, was UFC 217. Georges St. Pierre versus Michael Bisping. Now, this was Georges St. Pierre's long-awaited return, and I think what Georges St. Pierre saw, he was like, you know what, Michael Bisping's a champion. If there's any middleweight champion I can beat and become a double champ, it's Michael Bisping. So GSP hopped in there, and he beat up Michael Bisping and submitted him in the 3rd round, I believe. Knocked him down and then submitted him in the 3rd round. Just the spectacle of Georges St. Pierre coming back was enough for this card to be the best. I mean, GSP is a legend, one of if not the greatest fighter of all time. Anytime he's fighting, you're going to tune in. Then you had the TJ Dillashaw, Cody Garbrandt grudge match, which was a great fight. Cody Garbrandt drops him at the end of the 1st round, and people are like, oh, wow, TJ's done. But in the 2nd round, TJ comes back to head kick finish him. That was insane. Rose Namajunas knocking out Joanna Jędrzejczyk cold. That was crazy at the time whenever it happened. Wonder Boy piecing up Jorge Masvidal. And, I mean, Wonder Boy put a striking clinic on Masvidal. Paulo Costa sending Johnny Hendricks to the retirement home was great. James Vick actually KOing Joseph Duffy was crazy. How good was James Vick? He was 9-1 in the UFC at one point. And crazy how much of a fall off he had. Mark Godbeer versus Walt Harris. I think Walt Harris ended up getting DQ'd for an illegal strike. Ovince St. Preux knocking out Corey Anderson was beautiful. Randy Brown fraud checking Mickey Gall, completely fraud checking. And then you had Curtis Blades destroying Alexei Oleinik, out grappling him, and Ricardo Ramos KOs Ayman Zahabi. So this card overall was a great card. The build-up was great. The trash talk between Dillashaw and Garbrandt was very entertaining. The trash talk between St. Pierre and Bisping. Brother, GSP, I'm going to hit you so hard, you're going to think you're going to fall on the mothership. Brother, you're intoxicated, brother. You're intoxicated. Georges St. Pierre and Michael Bisping. So this fight card was great, in my opinion. One of my favorites. I watched the entire card with my family. It was a great time, guys. Tell me what you think about this one in the comments. Let's move on to 2018. My favorite card of 2018 for the UFC pay-per-views was 229. Now, guys, I don't have to say anything. This is the best-selling UFC pay-per-view of all time. The biggest grudge match, Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. The biggest UFC fight ever. I mean, this was crazy. The build-up was dark, and Khabib and McGregor had a real beef, which was crazy, like, to the point where, like, they literally wanted to kill each other. They hated each other. They didn't respect each other. McGregor was coming in off the Floyd Mayweather loss where he just collected a $100 million check, coming back to fight Khabib, and people were, like, wondering, like, who's going to win, the drunk Irishman or the Russian Khabib? I knew Khabib was going to win. There was no way McGregor was going to beat Khabib, who's a dedicated Muslim training every single day, whereas McGregor is out drinking proper 12 and promoting it. He's not even focused that much on the fight, and his foot was a balloon according to him. But it was a good fight nonetheless. Conor McGregor actually took the third round off of B, but ended up getting submitted by a face crank in the fourth, and then an all-out brawl ensued in the octagon, which was quite insane. So yeah, this fight lived up to the hype. It was insane. The build-up was crazy. Then in the co-main event, you had Tony Ferguson versus Anthony Pettis, which is an absolutely brutal fight. This was when Tony Ferguson was in his prime and destroying everybody. You know the famous picture of Tony Ferguson cutting up his opponents. Anthony Pettis was full of blood. Tony Ferguson destroyed him. Dominic Reyes versus Ovid St. Preux. Dominic Reyes was on his come-up. This was a year before his fight with John Jones, so he was still coming up. Michelle Waterson versus Felice Herrick. Not the best. Jussier Formiga versus Sergio Pettis. Solid fight. Vicente Luque, KO, and Jalen Turner. People forget, man. Luque has a KO over Jalen Turner. Aspen Ladd versus the bus driver, Tanya Evinger. What a fight that was. What an absolute banger, boys. Scott Holtzman versus Alan Patrick. Yana Kunitskaya, Lena Landsberg. Nick Lentz, Gray Maynard, Anthony Rocco Martin, Ryan LaFera. This card was 100% top heavy. Like the top 3 fights carried this card, but I had to, even though it wasn't the strongest card in terms of prelims and early prelims, I had to put it at number 1, given that this is the biggest grudge match in UFC history and the highest selling pay-per-view. And there's not a single fight in UFC history that's got me more hyped than this one. Like this fight, the hype behind this fight was insane. I literally had like the jitters waiting for them to walk out and fight. So yeah. Number 1 for 2018, UFC 229 for me. Let's move on to 2019. I have UFC 245, Usman versus Covington, the first one. Now, this fight was interesting because there was a lot of hype going into this fight because it was a mirror matchup. How does Usman versus Covington go? They have essentially the same style. What happens whenever they clash? Who comes out on top? And the fight proved to be competitive, back and forth, arguably 2-2 going into the 5th round. Super entertaining. I think Kamaru actually broke Colby's jaw in the 3rd or 4th round. And then Usman ends up getting a finish in the 5th round, potentially back of the headshots, but he gets the finish in the 5th round. And Colby Covington gets silenced and is a coward and doesn't do his post-fight interview. Then we also had Volkanovski versus Max Holloway 1, where people forget, man, Volkanovski actually outpointed and outleg kicked Max Holloway to earn a unanimous decision and take his title away from him. Max Holloway was in the middle of his title reign on like a huge win streak. This was quite a great win, but Volk got it done. Then you had Amanda Nunes versus Jermaine Durandamy for the title. Amanda Nunes just dominated. And that was actually 3 title fights on this card. I just noticed that. Marlon Moraes versus Jose Aldo. This was Jose Aldo's bantamweight debut. He lost the fight against Moraes. A lot of people thought he won. Either way, it was a good scrap. Then you had Petr Yan, BS apparently, versus Uriah Faber. Petr Yan destroyed Uriah Faber. Head kicked him into oblivion. This was a sad fight to watch because Faber was like 40 at the time. He should not have been fighting Petr Yan. But respect to Faber for taking the fight. Petr Yan destroyed him. That was a good fight to watch. Jeff Neal completely destroys Mike Perry. This was a brutal knockout, I think, in the 1st round. Good win for Jeff Neal. This was prime Jeff Neal. No, Jeff Neal's still good. Arena Aldana versus Ketlin Vieira. Good fight. I think that fight ended in a KO. Amari Akhmadov, Ian Heinich. Okay. Matt Brown gets a KO over Ben Saunders. That was nice. Chase Hooper, the GOAT, versus Daniel Tamer. I think Chase Hooper won this fight. Brandon Moreno versus Kai Kara France won. A solid scrap. Jessica I versus Viviane Araujo, and Poliani Soriano versus Oscar Pichoda. This fight card, prelims and main card, was very good. The main event lived up to the hype, I'd say, and the relatively unknown Volkanovski snags the belt from Holloway. So this 245, in my opinion, was the best card of 2019. I really enjoyed it, boys. Let's get on to 2020. Best card of 2020, UFC 251. Jorge Masvidal and Usman sell 1.3 million pay-per-view buys, which is actually insane if you think about it for a non-McGregor card. This was the fight where Jorge Masvidal steps up on 6 days' notice, flies to Abu Dhabi to fight Kamaru Usman. And man, people were so high on Jorge Masvidal because he was on that 3-fight tear against Darren Till, Ben Askren, and Nate Diaz. He was on a tear, looking like a world beater. And people were like, man, what happens when Masvidal gets in there with Usman? But Usman ended up foot stomping him and out-grappling him for 5 rounds. It was kind of a snooze fest. Nonetheless, the hype around the fight was insane, so I'm not mad about it. Holloway versus Volkanovski 2. Max Holloway coming for his revenge to get his belt back, and a lot of people thought he won this fight. He landed 2 head kicks, got 2 knockdowns on Volkanovski in the first 2 rounds, but Volkanovski was able to edge out those last 3 rounds and secure the decision win to keep his belt, edging 2 wins over Max Holloway, which is quite insane. Petr Yan in an all-out scrap with Jose Aldo. Jose Aldo hanging in there, looking good in the early rounds, but ends up gassing out, and Petr Yan gets a 5th round finish to claim the vacant bantamweight belt, so that was great. Namajunas versus Andrade, the rematch, that was solid. Hebas versus Paige Van Zandt. This might have been Van Zandt's last fight in the UFC, so nice. I think this was Yuri Prohaska's debut against Volkan Oezdemir. He KO'd Oezdemir in the first round. Really good KO. Brutal. Muslim Salikov versus Alexei Zaleski dos Santos. Solid fight. Makwan and Mirkani versus Danny Henry. Leonardo Santos, Roman Bogatov. The GOAT, Marcin Tybura versus Maxim Grishin. Julian Paiva versus Zalagas Zamagilov. Carol Rosa, Vanessa Milo, and Davy Grant Martin Day. This fight was definitely top heavy. I'd say the main card was amazing, whereas the early prelims and prelims were eh. But the main card was so good, I don't even mind. In my opinion, this was during the COVID era, and in my opinion, it was harder to put on fights. This was the best card of 2020. It was in Abu Dhabi, which made it sick. And yeah, Jorge Masvidal versus Usman. There was a lot of hype, and I enjoyed this card. So this is my favorite pay-per-view and the best pay-per-view of 2020, in my opinion. Let's move on to 2021, boys. I got Usman Covington 2, the rematch. Another fight that lived up to the hype, in my opinion. Usman Covington 2, back and forth war, even closer than the first fight. Actually made it to a decision. Covington dropped Usman at one point, and I think Usman might have dropped Covington too. It was a close fight. They were so evenly matched. It goes to decision, and Kamaru wins it, but man, it was a good fight. I enjoyed this one. Rose Namajunas, Zhang Weili 2. Namajunas KO'd Zhang Weili, and it was the rematch, and Rose Namajunas was able to outpoint her and beat her a second time. Marlon Vera getting that nasty front kick KO over Frankie Edgar, but Frankie Edgar, people forget, man, he was piecing up Marlon Vera before that KO, so shout out Frankie Edgar. Shane Burgos versus Billy Quarantillo. Shane Burgos, one of the most exciting UFC fighters you'll ever watch. It's a shame he went to PFL, but I respect the hustle to get more money. Justin Gaethje, Michael Chandler, an absolute barn burner. Michael Chandler throwing all of his IQ out the window to put a show on for the fans. Respect. He could have easily won this fight, but he chose not to. Alex Pereira's UFC debut versus Andreas Michailidis. I think he got a flying knee TKO, which was great. Bobby Green sleeps the real estate agent Ally Quinta. That was nice. Chris Curtis KOs Phil Halls, I believe. Nasruddin Imavov fraud checks Edmund Shabazian for the sixth time because Edmund Shabazian was never good. Ian Gary's debut versus Jordan Williams. He sleeps him. The GOAT, Chris Barnett, gets a wheel kick KO over John Vellante. That was sick. Justin Jacoby versus John Allen. I don't remember that fight. Melsik Bagdasharian versus Bruno Silva. Don't remember that fight. And Ode Osborne, I think, beat CJ Vergara. Either way, the prelims and the main card of this UFC event was crazy good. I enjoyed it. Bangers from the top to the bottom. The Gaethje Chandler fight, the Usman Covington fight, really good bangers. And yeah, guys, this was my card of the year for 2021. Let's move on to the card of the year for 2022. I had Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira, UFC 281. And yeah, this was one of the best storylines ever in the UFC. Alex Pereira, the Glory kickboxing champion who already had 2 wins over Adesanya, chases Adesanya down to come take his UFC belt and is successful. Now listen, I'd be lying to you if I said Adesanya wasn't winning this fight. He nearly slept Alex Pereira at the end of round 1, and then Alex Pereira started to put it on him a little bit after that, but Adesanya was holding his own. He was winning the fight, but in the 5th round, Alex Pereira took Adesanya's lunch money and took his title and won the belt by TKO. He was piecing up Adesanya, and the ref had to step in or Adesanya was going to faceplant. Good win by Alex Pereira. He becomes the middleweight champion, defeating Adesanya. Love that fight. It was a good fight. Zhang Weili versus Carla Esparza. Not the most exciting move. It was nice to see Zhang Weili show levels and destroy Carla Esparza, who just never was a good strawweight. Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler. Michael Chandler cheating as usual, fish hooking Poirier. And Dustin Poirier was actually getting pieced up in this fight, but Michael Chandler, in typical low IQ fashion, goes ahead and makes a technical error, tries to slam Dustin Poirier, ends up getting choked out. Fun fact, Dustin Poirier, the only guy to submit Michael Chandler. Chris Gutierrez gets a brutal KO over Frankie Edgar, a flying knee KO. That was insane. Dan Hooker fighting Claudio Puelles. Claudio Puelles in this fight was so embarrassing. This was a terrible look for this main card, but Dan Hooker beats him by TKO. Renato Moicano submitting Brad Riddell. Money Moicano, I cannot afford to lose, brother. Ryan Spann brutally KOing Dominic Reyes. This was kind of sad to watch. Aaron Blanchfield destroyed Molly McCann by submission. Andre Petrosky, I think, lost to Wellington Turman. Matt Favola fraud checking Adman Azaitar, who was undefeated. Matt Favola KO'd him. That was brutal. Karolina Kowalkiewicz versus Silviana Juarez. Don't remember that fight. Mikael Trezano versus Sung Woo Choi. I think he got a KO over Sung Woo Choi. Montel Jackson, Julio Arce. Solid fight. And Carlos Alberg getting a KO over Nikolai Nikamurunu. So, yeah, guys, this was my card of the year for 2022. The storyline between Pereira and Adesanya. Him having 2 wins over Adesanya in kickboxing and coming to the UFC to take his belt. That storyline was insane. The Poirier-Chandler fight was insane. The brutal KO of Frankie Edgar. Ryan Spann KO and Reyes. Hanato Moicano submitting Riddell. This card had it all. Matt Frevola, Farad Check, and Ahmed Azaitar. This is my card of the year for 2022. Boys, UFC 281. Let's get into 2023, last year. My card of the year, UFC 290, Volkanovski versus Rodriguez. Now, I'm not going to lie. Looking through the cards of UFC 2023, they were kind of weak. I was a little unimpressed with UFC 2023. Let me know what you guys think about that. But nonetheless, this is the card of the year. I had Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez. Volkanovski was coming off that extremely close fight to Makhachev where he was in his absolute prime. That was the best Volkanovski we've ever seen. So people were curious, how's he going to look back down at featherweight? Actually, people were like, man, these featherweights have zero chance against Volk. He's going to steamroll every last one of them. And what do you know? He went in there, picked Yair apart on the feet, eventually taking him down and getting a TKO on the ground. Good win by Alexander Volkanovski, showing he's just was levels ahead of the other featherweights. Pantoja Moreno, the second fight, a good scrap, a split decision. People forget, man, Brandon Moreno almost won that fight, but Pantoja comes through, becomes the champ. Dricus du Plessis lit Robert Whittaker up like the 4th of July and end up getting a TKO in the second round, submitting his spot as the #1 contender. That was great. Then Dan Hooker gets a split decision win over Jalen Turner. Embarrassing for Jalen Turner, but Tattoo Dan Hooker's a different beast. Bo Nickel versus Val Woodburn. Should have never been on the main card. Val Woodburn, unknown, took the fight on late notice. Bo Nickel gets a KO in like 30 seconds, I believe. Robbie Lawler's retirement fight versus Nico Price, getting a KO. Super amazing for Robbie Lawler, getting a KO for his last fight. And that was amazing to see. And then they gave him like a send-off like video package after. It was super wholesome. Tatsuro Taira versus Edgar Chavez. Nah. Denise Gomez, Yasmin Jaragoy. Nah. Alonzo Minifield, KO, and Jimmy Crute. Jimmy Crute might have some of the worst striking in UFC history. Vitor Petrino beating Marcin Praggnio by KO. Cameron Simon, KO, and Terrence Mitchell. Jesus Aguilar, KO, and Shannon Ross, I believe. And Esteban Ribovics beating Kamula Kirk by decision. This was a solid card. The prelims and the main card were really good, in my opinion. And yeah, man, Volkanovski showed he was still that guy. And Dricus du Plessis stamped his way to a title shot. So this card was a banger, boys. Let's get on to the best card of 2024, and I think you guys know what it is. A lot of you are going to say 298, and I think that's recency bias. 298 was great, but I have 300 as the best card of 2024. Now, I know that it's easy to say, be a casual and say UFC 300 was the best card of 2024. Like, bro, you're not a hardcore. Real hardcores know that UFC 301 was the best, bro. Pantoja, Usyk. Now, listen, boys. 2024 UFC 300. This card was stacked from top to bottom, literally, and the results of these fights were insane. First of all, you had Alex Pereira stepping in on short notice against Jamal Hill for the main event of UFC 300, and it was nice to see Jamal Hill get slept. I'm not going to lie. Jamal Hill talked a lot of crap coming into this fight. He talked a lot of big stuff, saying he was going to KO Alex Pereira on the feet and that in mixed martial arts, he's a better striker, blah, blah, blah. And Alex Pereira goes in there. He KOs Jamal Hill stiff with a shovel hook, and then he emotes on him. Legendary moment. In the co-main event, Zhang Weili outclasses Yao Jianan, a pretty dominant decision. In the feature fight, Max Holloway versus Justin Gaethje for the BMF belt. Now listen, Max Holloway was written off in this fight. People were saying Gaethje was too big, too much power. He's going to bust up Holloway. In the first round, Max Holloway lands a spinning back kick, busts Gaethje's nose up, and just pieces up Gaethje the entire fight. And with 10 seconds to go, Max Holloway points to the ground, like in the Ricardo Lamas fight, starts swinging with Justin Gaethje and KOs him out cold with 1 second to go. This is the most insane Max Holloway moment of his entire career. It was nuts to see live. I could not believe what I was watching. That was insane. Even Taporia in the crowd was shocked. Arman Tsarukyan versus Charles Oliveira. A good back-and-forth fight. Tsarukyan out-wrestling Oliveira, but Oliveira getting the better of the submission exchanges. Nearly locking up a Darce in the third round. I'd like to see this fight if it would have went 5 rounds. I want to see this rematch one day also. Bo Nickel, Cody Brundage. Not sure why on earth Bo Nickel was on a UFC 300 main card. He got a win over Cody Brundage, but he looked kind of lackluster in my opinion. Nonetheless, he got the win. On the prelims, You know, if Yuri Prohaska's on the prelims, this card was an absolute banger. Yuri Prohaska, Alexander Rakic. Rakic actually looked amazing in this fight, but Yuri autismed his way to a TKO win in the second round, I believe. Aljamain Sterling moving up to featherweight, his featherweight debut, and he absolutely dominated Calvin Kattar in the grappling, tossed him around like a chew toy, and yeah, Aljamain Sterling was successful in his featherweight debut. Kayla Harrison sending Holly Holm to the retirement home where she belongs at 42 years old. She does not need to be fighting. Kayla Harrison gets an easy rear naked choke. Diego Lopez, my favorite fighter, KOs Sadiq Youssef, whose name I spelled backwards, but the Sadiq Youssef, Diego Lopez goes in there and says, hey, brother, I'm coming up in the division. KOs Sadiq Youssef and ground and pounds him on the ground. Amazing win for Diego Lopez. On the early prelims, we had Renato Moicano beating Jalen Turner. One of the best comeback victories of the year. Jalen Turner tries to get a walk-off KO in the first round after he drops Moicano. He doesn't get it. The ref doesn't step in, so the fight goes on. Jalen Turner gassed out. Renato Moicano comes back in the second round to get the TKO. That was amazing. Andrade beating Marina Rodriguez. Solid fight. Bobby Green absolutely piecing up Jim Miller. And people were wondering if Bobby Green was still going to have it after that Jalen Turner loss. He did. He came back versus Jim Miller. He looked amazing. And yeah, Davison Figueiredo in his bantamweight debut submitting Cody Garbrandt, which was super impressive. I don't think Garbrandt had been submitted until then. And Garbrandt had what was known to be great wrestling. But yeah, guys, this is my best UFC events of the last decade from 2014 to 2024. Some absolute bangers. And you see as the years go on, the cards get sometimes worse, sometimes better, depending on the year. But no doubt, these are some of the best pay-per-views we'll ever see. Even if you disagree, you have to agree that the pay-per-views on this list were great. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you're new. Become a member. I just got partnered with YouTube Boys. You can now become a member on my channel. So look out for that. And yeah, as always, thank you guys for watching. Leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe. I'm out, and peace.